Here from the Morris area. Good to see you all. My name is Ben Winchester. I work for Community Vitality here in Extension. I am a rural sociologist. I like to study rural trends and all things rural. As you may or may not know, I do a lot of research around what I call the brain gain, and that is that we actually have people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that want to live in rural communities and have been moving there since the 70s. And we've been documenting this through Extension and really finding ways that, how are these newcomers taking on jobs? How are they getting engaged in their communities? But it really, for me, paints a new picture of rural America, and that is that we're not dying. If we were dying, then why can't I find a home to buy? That's my favorite question. We're not dying. We're in many ways, it's really rewarding to do the research I do because it shows that, there are a lot of positive things going on across our rural communities. I'm going to get started on the screen share here. And so it's really my pleasure to be here today on what I'm going to be dusting off a presentation that I haven't given. I've given portions of for a while. Hold on 1 second here. So here I am. I'm going to use a different way to kind of hello. You can see me here on with my PowerPoint in the background here. And we'll see that we've got a title here of Rural Leadership, Supply and Demand. It's like economic terms, but I use this to kind of categorize how we look at leadership in our community. And this started with a very simple question, probably 24 years ago, John Molinaro with the West Central Initiative in Fergus Falls. He was one of the first ones together with Nancy Straw that we talked about how many people do we need to run our town? Do we have any measures on this? And they had, kind of done some back of the envelope math about, we got four city councils, we got one county board, we've got all these soil water groups, we've, got nonprofits. Like, how do you calculate the amount of leaders that you need to run your communities? So anyway, that's my launching point. And so today, if you need any support, Lauren is here on the call, and she's our webinar support specialist. If you've got any questions, put them in chat, or you can text her directly. Otherwise, she'll be monitoring chat for us too. And again, Lauren, thanks for being here. And if you feel like there's some questions I'm missing that people are including here, please feel free to interrupt. So with that, I wanted to say I'm on version 9.0 of this research, and I do this kind of iterative thing where I do research around a topic and then I bring it to the community, and you all say, like, what about this? And then I go back to the laboratory and try to figure out the what about answers and then bring that back. So again, we're on version 9.0, which is this iterative process of me, inquiring about some of these aspects of community life and then bringing them to the community. So I'm going to step back a little bit and remind you all that I was really interested early on in my career at the work of Alexis de Tocqueville, he was a Frenchman who came to the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and he traveled around the eastern side of the U.S. and was really amazed at what this American thing was. And he had written about this in Democracy in America, which was published in 1831. And he had talked about how Americans, they're distinctly like associative. Like, man, whenever these people have a problem, they band together, they form an association, they rise up to meet that challenge, and then they dissipate back down. And then when the challenge comes up for the community again, you've got people that can band together, rise up, form an association, and dissipate back down. And this sounds great until you think of the one key missing aspect of that is dissipation. Like, typically we don't just form groups and then dissolve them when they're done. A lot of times our groups are formed for a specific purpose. And even when we meet that mission, they're like, well, we're already here. Let's just work on something else, right? And then you kind of get into mission drift, which we're not going to get into those types of organizational dynamics. But, essentially it's looking at the mission of organizations and the people behind them. So, and you all know rural communities, we have a lot of different people wearing a lot of different hats. You've got a lot of different organizations that serve our communities. You've also got groups that serve not just places, but regions or the state. So you kind of have a progression of leadership that's required too, from the local all the way up to the statewide level. So part of my response here is that, I would hear these proclamations all the time that social life is dying. We do have books like Bowling Alone and about the decline of social capital, and we don't have these opportunities for us to engage in social capital building activities when we don't have cafes in our rural communities anymore, for example. So the idea here is basically a response to the Bowling Alone, and it's not typical, but it is like the idea here is that maybe we should look at where people are spending their time. And, Putnam's idea was that people went from bowling in leagues to bowling alone, that type of social atomization, like individual type things. But more importantly, I want to look at where are the people. Did my share just stop? Did that just stop? Hold on one second. Sorry, folks. I'm not really sure what happened there. It looks like it's open, but it's not. There we go. We are just going to scroll ahead here. So just in response to this, I wanted to identify, like, where are the organizations that people are a part of today? How are they involved in those groups? And what does that look like? So I wanted to break it up into two things. The question around how many people do we need to run our town is composed of two pieces. How many organizations do we have that demand leaders? And then how many people do we have to supply that leadership? So you're going to hear the word supply and demand of leadership here throughout. So I used to call this social maintenance cost, but it's not really attractive as a concept, like, right, it was my grad school kind of research. But you know, essentially I'll use economic terms like supply and demand, right? And initially when I thought about maintenance, I thought about, like, we have to maintain our social groups too. Just like when you talk about like repainting the fences, like, what are we doing to maintain our social groups to ensure that they're keeping up with the times, that they're not becoming, you know, dilapidated or infested or anything like that. So there's only so many kind of comparisons you can make on the physical maintenance piece here. But ultimately, I do like to look at the organizational leadership structures of our small town. It's an infrastructure you've got, just as much as you've got water carrying pipes across your city. You've got people that make these that are in these relationships within your organizations. So let's look at the social aspects a little bit more closely here. So let's look at the demand side. On the demand side of leadership, it's how do we measure demand that organizations make upon the resident population? So on one side, we have governments, right? You have city council, county commissioners, township officers, right? In 2017, which is the most recent data, in 2017 across the US, there were 88,000 governmental units. In Minnesota, there's about 3,600, which is about 1 in every 1,500 people. But there's also these types of governmental units that you may or may not know about. And they're, you know, the city council and the county commissioners, everybody hears about them, but you don't hear about the people sitting on cemetery districts or sewer water districts or the soil water conservation boards. You know, you do see they're in elected positions at times too, but many are appointed. But ultimately, we have all of these kind of governmental positions that require leaders, right? So on one side, we've got this leadership demand. And we had just written an article here in the past year that we wanted to look at the comparisons of our rural and our urban places with regards to this demand for governmental leaders. And so we published an article here in response. There was some legislation being proposed at the statewide level here in Minnesota that was going to say, essentially, if you hold a government position, you are not then allowed to serve on a nonprofit board, was what the proposed legislation was, which of course it's like, well, in our rural communities, we know people wear multiple hats all the time. Like, what is going to be the impact of that, right? And so just to kind of differentiate from the most urban counties that we have in Minnesota, this is called the Rural Urban Continuum Code, the RUCC. And you have the most urban, and that's like Hennepin and Ramsey County, right? And then you go all the way to the most rural, which might be like Becker County. So essentially, we find in our most urban counties, 1 in 950 people have to serve as a leader in a governmental position. And again, we're only counting the people over the age of 18. And because you can't have 7-year-olds running your city council, right? So we just look at the number of people over the age of 18. And we look at that number divided by the number of governments. But we also need to make an assumption here. And this is a pretty big assumption about how many positions does each government need with a leader. So we made an assumption early on that we are going to need 5 positions in each government. So essentially, if you have 576 governments, you're going to need what, 25, 26, 2,700 leaders within that. So 576 times 5. So essentially, you take that 576 times 5, that's how many positions you need to fill. That is the demand. And then the population over the age of 18 is the supply of leaders. So what we find in our most urban communities, 1 in 950 people need to serve as a government leader. But in our most rural communities across Minnesota, we're down to 1 in 37. That's like 1 every couple of city blocks need to serve as an elected or an appointed position in a government agency. So on the other side of this, on one side we have governments, but on the other side we have nonprofits that live in our communities. And these nonprofits don't just exist randomly, like people create nonprofits. And I love, as a rural sociologist, I love nonprofits because they are reflections of who you are. When you create a group, it doesn't just get, dropped down in your community, you create a nonprofit. So we've got, for example, nonprofits that take disabled veterans out fishing. for example, and that just doesn't randomly happen. It happens because people have a passion and an interest. So when I talk about social life not dying here, my primary data point is nonprofits, because nonprofits are measures of social diversity. They are indications of social wealth, and we'll talk about how this looks. So now, what happened was in roughly 2011, 2012, I started running across this data set that had said there's a large number of nonprofits. So what this data set is from the National Center for Charitable Statistics is it's a database of all the nonprofits in the country. And when I tracked this over time, I saw that the number of nonprofits from 1995 all the way up through 2010 went up by 10 to 15% every 5 years. And that's not the story of social life dying. That's just the opposite. Like, and again, nonprofits take a lot of work to create. So when we look at this, it actually is like pretty good news, right? And then in 2012, 2011, there was a big wrench that was thrown into my data. I call it my data because I have become very personal with what this data says. But essentially, it gives us the number of nonprofits by county. Well, in 2011, 2010, really, they started this initiative that was implemented in 2011, is the IRS said, you know what? I don't think we really have like, what is it, like 1.6 million nonprofits in this country. I bet we have less than that. And so what the IRS did is they said, we need to clean up our database. So what they did was they sent out a postcard to every nonprofit in the country and said, just prove 1.6 million nonprofits that you exist by returning the postcard. That's all they had to do. Well, then the next year, they started to see people's status as an organization get revoked. Because if you did not return the postcard, they're going to assume that you're out of business. And many times these were groups that were active like 60 years ago, but they were still in their database. So then what happened is it looks like there's a decline in the number of nonprofits from 2010 to 2020, when really it's not. It's called the Great Cleanse. And it's really across Minnesota, we did reduce a large number of nonprofits. But if we didn't know that this cleanse happened, the great cleaning happened, it would look like the number of nonprofits went down from 2010 to 2020. Even though the trend line from 2000 to 2010 was positive, now it looks like it went down. Well, I actually was able to get a list of those organizations that were revoked from 2011 through 2019. It's not 2020. I had 2020 on there. That's wrong. But it's through 2019, the number that were revoked. And I added those back into the database to show the trend line. And it shows that the number of nonprofits is still going up. We did remove those 8,700 organizations that were defunct or not in existence anymore. So there was a way for me to kind of give a better trend line by estimating pretty accurately the number of revocations. What I wasn't able to do is to get this at the micro county level. So through the rest of this presentation, there's some caveats here. A majority of the analysis I did was the initial data up through 2012, right? And then you saw the big drop off in nonprofits, but these trends before that were all very positive. So I've got two changes, two analyses that are done here. One is kind of this old analysis with the 2000 to 2010 data, but one is the more recent data from 2010 to 2020, which includes revocations, but I don't have that at the county level. So yes, I see a comment here. We'll be sending a PowerPoint. So if you feel like you need to write all this down, please don't. Please just take it in. We will definitely be sending this out to you. So I am right now, I had to really update this database. It is a huge database, and I just got done with it in the past 6 months. And typically in the past, there was a person at the National Center for Charitable Statistics who manages this database. There would typically be a person to help me kind of translate this into the county boundaries and all this work. Well, that person left. And when that person left, they never rehired them. So essentially, I've had to learn about their job, and I finally got done translating the database from 2020 into something we can actually use. So I'm excited to share a lot of this with you. So here is the first chart in nonprofit change from 2000 to 2010, right? And again, that's the last reliable data pre-cleanse that we've had. And when I made these maps early on, this was our first map that we made. This was the number of nonprofits across the country goes up. And even in the southeastern part of the country, the number of nonprofits is going up by 40 to 50 to 60% over 10 years. And I was like, oh my gosh, is that real? Like, this seems like huge numbers of nonprofits because they're not easy to create. Again, nonprofits don't just sprout up out of nowhere. And then again, I was looking at the upper Midwest, like, man, our rate of growth really wasn't that great, but it seems like something's wrong because, why we have, like in Minnesota, we have super high levels of social capital in terms of all measures around home ownership is high. We've got all these aspects around community development that are real high. We've got a strong social network of rural development agencies. So essentially, we've got all these kind of positive things going on, but the number of nonprofits isn't going up at the same rate as those in the southeastern part of the country. And I really couldn't make sense of that at the time. And now here's the updated map from 2010 to 2020. We see very common similarities. Again, the growth rate in the Southeast is the highest and the upper Midwest is the lowest in terms of gains. But ultimately, every state gained in the number of nonprofits, again, between 2010 and 2020. Here's the old model. Again, the county level changes. And I'm using this just to show there are still some counties that lose nonprofits, right? Overall, at the state level, you're going to gain. But most of the times, the counties that lost from 2000 to 2010 were agricultural counties that had the highest average age in the country. And actually, in some of these counties across Nebraska and Texas now, we've seen a complete turnaround in their nonprofit growth. So initially, when I did this map early on in like 2012, 2014, here's the nonprofit changes by county. And again, we see some counties in the Northwest and along the border there that saw declines in nonprofits, but that doesn't mean you're losing all nonprofits. It means you're gaining some and you're losing some. Who are we gaining and who are we losing becomes the real question. But this also identified pockets of rural Minnesota that saw exceedingly large growth in the number of nonprofits, right? The whole central part of the state and the western side, like Pope and Stevens County and Swift County over there, they saw huge growth. We also see growth in the suburbs, right, which is expected. But ultimately, some of the growth patterns that we see across rural Minnesota were real positive. So here's an example of a county profile I generate. I presented in Chisago County to talk about their rural narrative. And, we looked at the number of nonprofits and the number of governmental units. And again, a reminder that there's this great cleanse that happened in between those two. And it would look like the number of nonprofits between 2010 and 2020 was flat, when in fact, they reduced that number by a certain number, which I don't exactly know. But it was interesting to see that the number of nonprofits has been stable, if not going up. And just like a fun fact, I've got a list of all the nonprofits. I just searched for lake or lakes in all the nonprofit names, and a full-on 15% of all nonprofits in Chisago County have lake or lakes in their title. So just as a relationship to your environment. But when we also look at Chisago County, this is some of the data that we can get into behind the National Center for Charitable Statistics database, is you get not just the number of nonprofits, which again, between 2010 and 2020, there's like cleanse that happened there. But I want to point to one characteristic here, which is the number of organizations that are filing full 990s. And when nonprofits file a full 990, not all nonprofits have to file. This is like a full-on tax form. It's like the full 1040 versus the 1040 EZ. Many nonprofits don't have a revenue of $50,000 or more a year. And if they don't, they can file this kind of postcard tax form. It's very simple. But if an organization has revenue of over $50,000 or more, they have to file a full 990. So what this reflects is the number filing full 990. And you see it was a quarter of all nonprofits in 2000. And it's it's like almost 3/4 of all nonprofits in Chisago County are now generating $50,000 or more in revenue. That's a big positive for me. When you look at the revenue of these nonprofits in the county, they went from 76 million up to 367 million over 20 years. And more importantly for me, the assets of these filers went from 132 million to $681 million. Nonprofits aren't just some wayside shop that you go to on the side. Nonprofits are significant business and community development actions and activities, and employ a large proportion of our population, not just across the state, but across this country. But for me, I like this item around assets, because in many ways, our nonprofits are vehicles of social investment. Like, I can't invest in Hardware Hank on Main Street, but I can invest in my Red Cross. I can invest in my Community Betterment Club. And this is where we start to see the investments that the community is making in these nonprofits is reflected in the revenue, and more importantly, the assets of these groups across the community. So again, Chisago, the percentage of groups filing full 990 is part of this in 2000, 2010 is an artifact, because you've got a number of nonprofits there that are not generating revenue. Good and are probably going to be removed. So when I brought them home, already had pink bags on. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So essentially, when we look at the proportion of organizations that are filing full 990s, it's going way up. It's almost even across the state, like 3/4 of nonprofits are now filing these full 990s. So when we look at the characteristics, some of the other counties here, Candy, Ojai, again, you see that cleanse there, but that doesn't mean everybody's leaving. They still have 268 nonprofits. And those 268 nonprofits, their assets doubled over 20 years, their revenue doubled over 20 years. Again, this isn't the narrative of nonprofits struggling. This is the narrative of nonprofits actually being a vehicle for social investment within our rural communities. So we also see here a couple other counties that you may know across Minnesota here. Benton County, Crow Wing, Sherburne, and Stearns County are included here too. Benton, again, the proportion of organizations filing full 990 has become significant. So one of the early, I had done a journal article that talked about this kind of nonprofit assets using the 2010 data. Again, I'm kind of going back and forth here, but it showed in this article I had written for the Rural Minnesota Journal that these are vehicles for social investment. The per capita nonprofit assets is significantly high in many of our rural communities, especially targeted toward our rural regional centers, but also that this varies by region and that the asset growth in these nonprofits well exceeds the rate of growth of inflation. So again, for me, these nonprofits are vehicles of social investment that we make with our time. When we look at the variation by region, this is a chart from that Rural Minnesota Journal article. There's a link to this on the slide right here, right at the bottom right there. So if you want to look into this, you can. So really for me, social life is not dying. We've got great nonprofit growth, and we look at the comparisons of population change to nonprofit growth across the upper Midwest and related states. And I know Tara Mastel is here with Montana. Hello, we got some of your data here too, that that we tend to still see nonprofits grow at a rate that's larger than the rate of population change of 18-year-olds or greater. So again, in Minnesota, in the last 10 years, we had a 9% population change, but the number of nonprofits went up by 16%. Montana, 11% population growth, but the nonprofits went up by 20%. I mean, these are huge numbers. And it seems like a small number, like it's just 7%, right? But just 7% is a very significant number when it comes to actually creating social vehicles of investment. So what about the supply side? What about the people? So that's really the demand side. That's organizations, they're increasing, right? But what about people? So what I do know is that, social life is diversified across our rural communities too. We're not all, we don't all have the same background. We don't all have the same job. We are much more diversified than ever before. And for me, again, as I mentioned, like nonprofits reflect your social interests. They reflect who you are. So if this were 1880, you would see a lot of social organizations around temperance, like no drinking, no sex type groups were very popular in the late 1800s. So our farrier groups dealing with horses and homemaker groups, like they just look different, right? How people got involved before, because it reflects like who you are as a society. But today is not 25 years ago or 50 or 100. Like the groups that we have today are vastly different than the groups that we had 50 years ago. So then we would keep hearing this consistent message that, well, I know, Ben, you do all this brain gain research and that these new people are moving in, but where are they? They're not part of my groups. And I say, you're right. They're not part of your groups. They're part of theirs. And you don't know where they're spending their time. So we need to be very careful about this kind of language that we use about where people choose to spend their time socially. So there's a concept out there, where we ridicule the young people about being selfish and everything. And so we do have these are just covers of the magazines, right? So 1968, the generation gap, and about the young people that are, disillusioned or whatever, right? And the me decade or 20 somethings. What year was this one here? 1990, right? And then 1996 or 2007, 2013, it's all about me or the me decade, the me generation. The one consistency here is selfishness, and it doesn't seem to vary by generation. It seems to be that we really like to ridicule the younger people and talk about how selfish and entitled they are. And that actually, I put on the first slide, is called Kids These Days. Malcolm Harris wrote a book called Kids These Days, The Making of Millennials, and how about every generation looks to the kids these days and talks about how selfish they are and they don't care about the community. And I want to remind you all that when you call people like selfish and entitled, if you ever happen to do this or be around people that do that you couldn't say a more disrespectful or humiliating thing to that person if you tried. Why would anybody want to be involved in your community if you're ridiculing how people choose to spend their time? It raises the hair on the back of my neck every time I hear this kind of ridiculing nature about these young people and where they want to be involved. But again, I'll remind you all, baby boomers that are calling the young people selfish and entitled, that's what you were called too, right? By your parents. And now it's a vicious, vicious circle, folks. So I hope to get your commitment that you will take some time to learn about where the young people are actually spending their time and what passions they have, because it definitely looks different than it did. So there's some research out there. So even Gen Zers are starting to believe all these cliches about Gen Z, like, I guess I am entitled. I guess so. I don't know any better. Like, I mean, it really is. It's pervasive how this narrative can impact the impetus and the motivation people have for being involved. So we really are very complex socially. We don't just have one interest that we do. I used to teach statistics at the University of Minnesota Morris. I stepped in for Engin Sunger for a number of years, and I used to have this finals question. And it started with, we were at a Chinese restaurant, and I got this, the fortune in the cookie that said, "You're unique, just like everyone else." And it's very telling in that this gets to social complexity too. So when we talk about our uniqueness, we are unique, but any one aspect of our lives, we're probably not that unique, right? So when it comes to music, like I like Depeche Mode, there's lots of other people who like Depeche Mode, right? Not everybody though. And then I also like to go fishing. Okay, so now let's draw that Venn diagram of people that like Depeche Mode and like fishing, and that's getting to be a smaller group, right? And now let's get into people that like fishing and like go hunting grouse, right? So now you start working into kind of all of these different social aspects of your life, and you're right. No one person is just like everybody else. You are unique. You're also unique, just like everybody else who is made up of their interests. So, when we talk about how people are involved in our small towns, there has been a major shift that's occurred. Historically, people would be involved in these kind of place-based groups with a broad focus. So it would be, I know we talk about like the Hancock Community Betterment Club, and this helped everything in Hancock. It would help like raising money for the firemen to do something there, or raising money for the church, or helping to build a new playground for the school, whatever it was. It didn't matter. It only served Hancock though. It didn't help Benson down the road. It was the Hancock Community Betterment Club. So a narrow geography with a broad focus. Today, people want to be involved in just the opposite on both axes. So rather than a broad focus, it's a narrow focus. And instead of a narrow geography, it's a broad geography. So ultimately, you see groups like the West Central Minnesota Snowmobile Association or these bicycling clubs, right? They're very specific interests, and their single motivation is not necessarily geared around that community of place, but around that community of interest. And here is where the divisiveness lies in almost all of the asks that I see. And many of the characteristics around our small towns and rural places where people work on place-based activities and other people work on interest-based activities. And it takes a lot of work to actually bridge those two mechanisms to ensure that you're building social capital across your rural communities. So we do know that the nonprofit types have changed as well. We've seen an increase in animal related, an increase in community improvement, recreation, and sports nationally. In Minnesota here, it holds true as well. Arts, culture, and humanities groups saw great increases. Education groups have a large sector, right? And also saw some growth. Animal related is not like Eagles and Lions clubs. That's like, shelter and rescue groups for actual animals. So they've seen a great growth. We spend so much money on animals, folks. This is one of the greatest nonprofit growth industries we've seen in the past 10 years. So anyway, and people spend a lot of money on their pets. We also see an increase in religion related. This is an artifact. We have not seen an increase in the number of churches, but we have seen an increase in the number of churches that have applied for 501c blank status because they need to be an authentic nonprofit in order to receive or give out donations, like real donations. So what we have seen is a large number of churches acquiring their IRS status, their nonprofit status. So this is an artifact. A lot of times I remove religion related from the analysis that I do. So now this is the new stuff. I was able to update the data for 2020. When we look at the composition of all of our nonprofits around Minnesota, we see number one is churches and religion-related spiritual development groups. Number two is recreation, sports, and leisure. 2 and 3 are usually swapped in one form for all states, and that's between recreation and educational institutions. So again, we have a lot of groups that support our kids, that support adult education as well. And then we get into groups like public societal benefit, multi-purpose, human service, community improvement. Philanthropy is actually a large growing one, but it just shows that, we aren't just a monolith here. We've got a lot of different interests and we capitalize in a lot of different areas. When we look at the number of groups that were formed in just the past 30 years. So since 1990, 56% of all nonprofits in Minnesota were formed in the past 30 years. So really the nonprofit sector is continually changing. So the idea here is that, you don't just walk into a small town and find all our old groups. Like you actually have to go out of your way to find out where the new groups are too, because many times these newcomers are involved in some of these groups. The resident population has not been involved in these groups and may not even know about all these other groups. So ultimately what this chart again represents is the number of new groups that does not include religion, because that's an artifact. So I remove those. And in Minnesota here, we also have the legacy amendment. So we've got a lot of support for arts, recreation in this state that many other states don't. So a lot of times you see growth in Minnesota in arts, culture, humanities, and recreation. That's a lot of times going to be due, and we have not seen any studies, but it would be interesting to know how much that stimulated growth in the nonprofit sector. So really, we live in one place, but you may have heard me talk about this. We live in the middle of everywhere. We don't live in the middle of nowhere. We put our residential home in one location, but we shop and work and play in these huge areas. And so if we're doing community development work in a community and wanting to, mobilize our nonprofit sector, you have to do more than just work with the nonprofits in that town, because you've got people in that town that are engaged in nonprofits that may have their home nonprofit 2 counties away. Like bicycle groups, you get people in these bicycle groups for 7 counties big, and that nonprofit may only be in Norman County, but I'm not in Norman, I'm in 2 counties south, right? And I'm still part of the group. But if I don't know that that nonprofit exists, how do you ever make referrals to new people that may actually like to bike? How do you talk to new people about where they are? And if you can't name off things that people may actually socially enjoy in the region, you really are in the middle of nowhere if you cannot talk about living in the middle of everywhere. So what are the implications here? Right? So if the number of organizations goes up, that could be fine if the number of people goes up, right? But if the number of organizations goes up, but the population goes down, then there's just more demand for our existing pool of leaders, right? Or what if our organizations go down, but our population went down too, so that's okay. So the demand is the same. Or your population could have went down so fast that the number of nonprofits, even though it went down, are still experiencing a large increased demand for leaders. So there's all these situations in this. And generally, I do only look at people over the age of 18, right? Because they're the only ones that can hold positional leadership positions or positional leadership. But ultimately, this varies by age too. You don't have a ton of 18 to 25-year-olds serving as leaders. You also don't have a ton of people over the age of 80 serving as leaders in your communities. So there's always asterisks around this research. So I just ask you to kind of bear with the asterisks as we go through. So I wanted to better understand, how do we compare our urban and our rural places? So we created this indicator called population per organizational role. And this is how many people does every organization, government or nonprofit, have to look to in the community to find just one leader? So we make some assumptions here. We assume that every government position is going to need 5 people to serve, and every nonprofit is going to need 6 people to serve on its board. To be honest, I have yet to sit on a board that small. So these are extremely conservative estimates in terms of demand for our leaders. So let's just say in this one community, if you've got 2 government positions and you've got 9 nonprofits, then you would have 10 positions that need to be filled on the governmental side there, and 9 times 6 is 54 positions there. So if you add them together, you need 64 positional leaders. And if you have 6,400 adults in the community, then 1 in 100 people must serve as a leader. This becomes our data point, 1 in 100 people. So we're going to make these assumptions here, and we'll share this with you too. Well, if we look now at that the same states that we had looked at earlier, and we look at the total number of organizations, we look at the number of people over the age of 18, and then what is that demand? We see in Montana's here, you have the highest demand for nonprofits. They ranked, so that ranking in the fourth column there is their ranking in all leadership positions, and then the ranking in just nonprofits in the country. So Iowa ranks fifth. They have the fifth highest demand for leadership overall, but in just the nonprofit sector, they have the second highest demand for leadership in the country. Kansas, 20 people have to serve as an elected or appointed position leader. And that ranks 11th overall for all leadership positions. And then for just nonprofits, it ranks 12th in the country. Montana, I'll pick on you, 1 in 13 people. You have the highest demand for leadership in the country. So one person per block has to serve as a leader across all this whole state, right? And that ranks second highest demand in all positions. But when you look at just nonprofits, Montana has the highest demand for leaders. In Minnesota, 1 in 21 people, 1 in 21 adults must serve as a leader in either a government or an elected position. So then we can look at like where do we have some of our stresses across the county? Kitson County, 1 in 5 people have to be engaged as a leader, as a nonprofit or a government positional leader. And of course, people wear multiple hats and things, right? We're kind of washing that out here. We recognize that happens. Not everybody is going to serve, but this gives us some idea of how to compare county to county, region to region, to see where are we experiencing leadership distress. So this is one of the indicators that we had used, which is population per organizational role. Grant County, 1 in 7 people have to serve as a leader. Big Stone County, 1 in 8. And what are the implications here? I mean, imagine Extension, we're going to offer a new program in Kitson County. We're like, hey, Kitson County, we're going to have a meeting on Wednesday night. We're going to talk about this new program we're going to offer. And then nobody shows up. And then we're like, oh, this committee must not care about, this program. When ultimately we should look at the data and show that these people are so tapped out. Like, why are we like demanding they come to us? Maybe we should be spending our time going to all these groups and talking about the project we may have. So the implications here are really severe in terms of how you do community development training when the demand for leaders is already through the roof, right? So I will skip ahead to the next one. So when we look at the population per organizational role across the country, again, we've got fairly high demands. So now, you remember this map earlier that showed the number of nonprofits in the southeast, right? And the South were growing at like 40 to 50%. And I was like, how can that be? Like, I thought our social capital was way higher, and we would see nonprofit growth so much higher in Minnesota and Montana than we would in, Georgia and Alabama and Florida. What this chart shows is even though the number of nonprofits in the Southeast went up by 40 to 50%, they still have not caught up with the number of organizations we have in the upper Midwest per capita. So we are at 1 in 21 people that have to serve as a nonprofit leader. Florida is down to 1 in 38. It used to be like 1 in 58. Well, they keep creating new nonprofits, but they're still not to where we are in terms of nonprofits per capita. So when we look at population per organizational role, again, we see the high demands for leadership positions to be filled across the upper Midwest. And here's that ranking of all the states. And this is of overall organizational demands, not just nonprofits. So this is the old model, but I just wanted to show, I haven't done this update yet because I'm waiting, you'll see here in a little bit. Again, I've got 2 models I'm working with. My old model, which was before the Great Cleanse, and the new model, which does give us a lot of information about where all these nonprofits are. But under the old model, we see some of the highest demands for leadership, like Nicollet County under the old model, 1 in 8 people had to serve as a nonprofit leader. That's down significantly. The demand is up to like 1 in 5 or 6 or something like that. But ultimately, you see that the pockets of our highest demands are in our most rural communities. It is here that we have volunteer lives that drive our communities and run our towns. So when we look at the change in leadership demand, this you can look at let's say the demand for leaders 10 years ago was 1 in 24 people, and now it's 1 in 14. The demand increased by 50%. right? This is a chart I had made in like 2011 using the 2010 data that showed which counties actually experienced the greatest change in demand for leaders. And I wanted to use this as, how do we know if we were to offer leadership programs in extension? How would we know where to go? If we were to take a map of the state and say, hey, where could we offer leadership programs? It's in the counties in deep red, because they are the counties that experience the greatest demand growth for leaders than anybody else across the state. So I will be updating that. Actually, this will be updated. So I've got the 2020 data, the 2021 and 22 data will be out very soon. I was waiting for some stuff to be cleaned up on 2021, but it sounds like I might just be updating it for 2022. So I can replicate this map for 2020 to 2022, probably next year. So if you're interested in looking at a profile for your county, please let me know. So getting back to this paper that we had written just last year about the demand for leaders, we find that in our most urban counties, then, given the number of nonprofits, and every nonprofit needs 6 positions, and then we take the people over the age of 18 divided by the number of nonprofits times 6, we find in our most urban communities in Minnesota, 1 in 26 people need to serve as a leader in the nonprofits. But in our most rural communities, now we're down to 1 in 9. Like, that demand is so high in our most rural communities. And again, we wonder, what are the implications here? So we do know that nonprofits are actual positive. Like the recession of 2008, actually, it shows if you've got more nonprofits per capita, like we do in our rural communities, you have lower unemployment during the recession. You lost fewer jobs during the recession. And all of those things held true with controlling for education, income, home values, and other economic characteristics. So the presence of a nonprofit sector is actually super valuable to your community to protect itself from economic shocks. And this nonprofit sector is actually quite big. It employs 10% of the total workforce. It's the 3rd largest industry sector in the United States. And really, between 2007 and 2016, employment growth there grew by 17%, while for-profit employment only grew by 5%. We do know that leadership demands are becoming further stressed as, so there was this article, and this was from 2011, but this is, I use this in here because this could be replicated every year. Like, the city is trying to find volunteers to help, they want residents in the city to help out with some type of take care of the parks or whatever it is. Well, right now we're relying upon volunteers and our leaders to actually do more in the position than just make kind of administrative leadership decisions. MAVA, Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration, has done surveys quite a bit over the years that help us kind of track how our nonprofits and the relationship to volunteerism has changed. So, and I talk about volunteerism here because ultimately, like, even if you've got growth in your nonprofit sector, you may have a limited number of volunteers. So now, is your nonprofit sector just competing over the limited number of people that you've got in your community? So this becomes important to consider as we move forward. We did find out, Rural Futures Institute in Nebraska they do this rural survey every year. And this one, and again, I keep this from 2004, just because this is such a part and parcel of our rural narrative, is that you just have to be active in community life. And they had found 1 in 4 people had run for or accepted appointment to public office or led their voluntary organizations. So really, 1 in 4 people had found to serve as a leader. So now we've done this research. Minnesota, Montana replicated this newcomer study here just last year. We did our latest newcomer study in 2019. We asked people like, who are you? In terms of new people that moved into our small towns and rural places. Because the idea here is that nobody ever moves into our small towns. When people do, there's always people. And what we found is that the number of people, just one data point I want to hit on. If you haven't heard me say this before, not everybody moving into your community is from there. In fact, we found in our research year before the pandemic, just a quarter of newcomer households moving into our rural communities are from there. And it's easy to see newcomers that are from there because you recognize their face or they've got a family name you recognize. But I'll remind you that then 3/4 of new people moving into your community are not from there. What type of experience do they have? And I know this is the hair raises on the back of my neck kind of stuff, is that these newcomers they come in, it's like, oh, hey, Sarah, you're new to town here. Do you want to sit on our chamber board? It's like, you're treating her like a warm body. You have no idea who this person is, right? So then what type of involvement do they get? Or even if Sarah has good ideas, it's like, wow, you just need to learn how we do it around here. We have to watch out how we truly like welcome and I mean, we actually need succession planning for leadership in our communities to talk about how do we succeed from one kind of genre of leadership to another, because even the leadership, the composition of those leaders looks different and how they want to lead looks different. So ultimately, this one data point becomes important for me because it shows that new people moving in are not from there. They may not always fit in with the social infrastructure that already exists, and we might have to be okay with that. How can we then actually allow newcomers to define what these groups mean for them becomes a bigger question. So we did ask newcomers. We had a bunch of sections in our newcomer survey. One of them was around community engagement. We asked, like, how often in the past year did you work on a community or regional project? And, never, to a few times, to a number of times a month, to at least once a week, right? And, when you're working on a community or regional project, you don't expect people to be working on that every week anyway. So you have to consider the relative frequency of each question and what is reasonable, right? So when we look at some of these about having friends from your community over, very few people actually put never on here, right? So people are actually very social and became involved and became, accepted as members of the community. When we look at comparing Minnesota and Montana here, some of these percentages, we asked the questions slightly different, but the way I brought these together, I think allow for some comparisons that seem very significant. But this shows how often did you engage with the community one time or more? Right. So now we see what percentage of newcomer households worked on a project. And so this isn't really being we don't have any criteria to say what number is right here, right? These are just numbers that represent where we are. So if we believe that, more people should be volunteering, then that's a data point you should be working on in your community to move that up from 1 in 4 people to, 1 in 2 or whatever that strategy is. We also see that people aren't, attending church like they used to. Everything is different with regards to these newcomers and how they generally want to be involved. So I just wanted to look at those who indicated never. Right, again, kind of going back to this chart here, worked on a regional project, never. I just want to look at the never category because that gives me an indication of where people may not feel comfortable. Like I never had friends from the community over to my home. I never visited people. What are some of the reasons why that doesn't happen? Where do people show a never at a higher rate? So transplants, and so there's 2 people I'm looking at here. Transplants are people that are from a whole nother place, and then they moved into Hancock, but they were from New York or whatever it is, right? But returnees are people that grew up in Hancock, moved away, and then moved back when they were 38 with their son, whatever it was. So ultimately, we kind of looked at the percentage of people who said never. And what are some of the differentials there? So again, if you're a transplant, you generally, a third of them never had long-time residents over to their home, while returnees, a quarter of them never did. So you had more people that were returnees that would have people over, more people that visit long-time residents. There was a big differential on people who never attended religious services. If you were moving in as a transplant, a full-on third of people are not going to church. But if you're from there, it's still 1 in 5, 20%. So there's a few characteristics, but these aren't really judgmental characteristics, that's good or bad. It's more something about this is where it is. Can we improve upon that? Are we happy with that? Because there's no kind of standard that we set here. So there's other implications now. Number one, your new residents are more than warm bodies. They can't just be like, hey, Sarah, you're new here and you want to join our board kind of stuff. And really these younger people, they just like to lead differently. They like the decentralized approaches to leadership. They like, not necessarily sitting in a meeting and listening to committee reports for 25 minutes as people, are accountable for their actions since the last meeting. That ultimately they want to work on task forces and have some level of trust without accountability in front of the group. Not that you don't have accountable actions. It's just that, why would you do that? And simplified methods of communication actually means more complex. How do you advertise that you're going to have a community meal on Friday, right? We'll put it in the newspaper. Is that on the front page of the website? Because if it's not on there, I'm probably not going to see it. No, we put it on the radio. Like Pandora, right? How do you get the word out? And then we did flyers and we put them up. The number one method of effective communication for mobilization on community development is a text message. But what do you need for a text message is a relationship. So ultimately, it isn't about the ask. It isn't about the sit on the board, Sarah. It's like, hey, Sarah, I know you're new in town here. We're going to be flipping burgers for the firemen on Friday. Do you want to help us out. I think you can meet a lot of people there, right? Start with a small request. You don't turn someone into a leader right away. You've got to even get to know who they are, and getting past the warm body approach means welcoming in these new people, identifying where their passions are, and sometimes you have to engage these people in ways that they've never been engaged before. So I'm going to kind of elevate the conversation back up to the 10,000 foot level. So if you're looking at your community or your county and you're looking down at all these groups and the people and how they're shifting their involvement, how do you deal with this? How do you talk to your other leaders across your community about this competition? You've got more groups. You're competing for the limited number of leaders, the limited number of volunteers, and financial resources that your people in your community have. So now, how do you get past competition? It's how do you actually work with these new groups? Sometimes these new groups, these new people, all they need to do is feel like they have an investment in the new group. So I call it clearing the slate for newcomers. And I talked about how one of the communities I was living in, I had a knock at the front door 2 weeks after I moved in, and there was a person at the front door, and he was like, "Hey, I knew you're in town here, new in town here. Are you ready to join the Lions Club?" And I was like, "I don't know, I guess. Like, how would I say no to somebody who shows up at my door, like welcoming me into town?" So I got the yellow coat and I went to the Lions Club meetings and stuff, but like I was single, I didn't have kids at the time, and really none of the stuff that they did interested me. To be honest, I didn't feel like my talents were actually being used. And so in many ways, like I wish it wasn't like, "Hey, here's the 5 things we're doing every year. Which one do you want to sign up for?" Right? It's more like, "Hey, here's a number of things that we do. Or do you have any ideas for how we could accomplish our mission? Like, do you have passions or interests in a certain area?" Because many times you can achieve your mission in many different ways if you give agency to the people in that organizations to do so. So I do talk about on the micro level, just clearing the slate, actually having activities that are geared towards and for and driven by newcomers. And really getting back to that 10,000 foot level is maybe we should have a leadership summit amongst the nonprofits to talk about some of these trends and the implications. So what can you do? We can develop programming. We have had programming. You can connect organizations, right, to work better together. And we know that that type of regional cooperation works in building social capital and doing community development work. But really, for me, this does allow us to rebuild this sustainable social infrastructure. And again, that's the term, my graduate student term, social infrastructure here. You've got people that are doing all these different things. How do you ensure that your groups are capitalized in the ways they need to be capitalized? How do you ensure your people are engaged in the ways they should be engaged? So what can you do here to help solve some of the problems that this brings up, right? One solution is just to expand the base of leaders, have more leadership training for your people in town, create more leaders, right? Human capital development. And so, like early on in my career, I used to look around and be like, man, there's all this kind of leadership training across the state between Extension and Bush does a bunch of stuff. Landon has our BCLP, and like, man, there's all this overlap. Like maybe there's too much. And then when I got done with all this research, I was like, we don't even have enough. We have nowhere near as many leadership programs as we need to help like bring our leadership capacity up, in my opinion. So that's one thing we can do, is just train people in how to be better leaders. But that engagement starts with a small request. Or we can merge organizations, right? We can actually have the organizations become more effective when they may be struggling boards of 2 or 3 people and they're struggling to have their events every year. Maybe we should actually be building some social capital between those organizations and potentially even merge them. Or you can actually reduce the demand on your leaders by dissolving groups. This isn't my favorite recommendation, but it kind of gets back to that de Tocqueville thing about like he was always amazed that the community would rise up, meet a challenge, and dissolve back down. And then they could mobilize themselves again when the next challenge arose. Well, there's like a never-ending string of challenges, apparently, in every one of our communities, to the point that we have groups that are currently more than busy. So what's next for research? I know Teresa's on here with 100 Rural Women. Hello, really appreciate the voices you're bringing to rural Minnesota. And for me, it is what's next for research? What happens to leaders that rise up and are pulled away from serving locally? This is one basic question I've got, because just even in my own life's experience, like when I first started to get involved in like community development work, and I was at the Center for Small Towns in Morris, and I sat on like our chamber board, but then I sat on a regional development group, and then I was asked to sit on a statewide panel of something, right? And ultimately what I found out, one November, I realized I wasn't serving Hancock anymore. I wasn't on a single board in Hancock or Morris. There was nobody around. I was pulled to all these leaders. I was asked, right? I said yes to serve on these different groups, but ultimately I literally was like, I'm not serving Hancock anymore. So what happens then when we pull our successful leaders up, right? And what happens locally? So who is serving in the positions now? So I think the work that Teresa is doing and bringing some attention to the fact that we don't have women in leadership in the same proportion that we would expect, right? Or when we talk about BIPOC communities too, to what extent are we actually representing Minnesotans? There is very little research on this. So this isn't in my database either, but requires actually on the ground kind of research. So we are hoping to see some results from this to better understand who is serving in these elected and appointed positions now, and to what extent do they represent all Minnesotans. And for me, now that we're over the crux of that big cleanse, because ultimately the big cleanse, everyone, was a huge wrench in all my research, because ultimately all the comparisons from 2010 to 2020 could never be done in a way that made me happy. I've done it, but I'm not super happy about it, right? But ultimately now we can begin this longitudinal study again. So as I mentioned, the 2020 data is out, 2021 and 2022 is going to be out the door very soon. We can start looking at changes year to year now, and use that as a guide to understand where are we seeing these changes happen across the state, which communities are undergoing some of the most significant stresses across the state. So again, I even mentioned that here, measure stress and resilience as it varies across the state. Like, to what extent are the assets growing and why are they growing? So there's that. And then examine the types of groups that are new and work with those that are undergoing these changes, and really maybe help close up shop for some of these groups. Like, are you ready to be done? Like, I don't know. But it is actually having a conversation to recognize that that might actually be a solution to some. So thank you all for putting up with version 9.0 of this work and all the new maps. I'm seriously looking for feedback on what you want next. This has been my career, the cyclical nature of I do research. I hear the implications. You want to know more about something. This is our job in extension. It is certainly my pleasure to serve you all across the state and to help support the activities that you've got. I'm just real blessed that we've even got an extension that offers this, and that we've got a land grant responsibility that brings all this knowledge out to you. So with that, thanks, Sarah, for kind of heading up this webinar series here. Do you want to take it off?
Yes, thanks, Ben. Thank you so much. You are so passionate about your work. We encourage folks to put questions or comments in the chat. If you need a certificate of participation or UMN, University of Minnesota Wellbeing Points, if you're on their insurance plan, we ask that you complete the evaluation. And Ben, I'm not sure. Can you click me to the next slide? There you have it. Great. Complete that evaluation. Lauren is going to put that link in the chat, and you'll be directed on how to get those items. We will be sending a follow-up email today or tomorrow with a PDF of the PowerPoint slides and Ben's links. And we will be getting the recording out to you as well, but down the road a little bit, because we need to do some closed captioning and that kind of thing. We do have a variety of other webinars coming up. This webinar fit in the No Place Like Home piece, and we do have one left in that series. We've got a couple webinars left in our recovery and health. We're going to flip through these super quick. And then we encourage you to get social with our University of Minnesota Extension Center for Family Development. Subscribe to our family news e-newsletter there, and we'll include those links in the follow-up email as well. Do we have one more slide, Ben? There we go, the final one. Thank you again, everyone, for participating. I think we'll hang out here for just a few more minutes if folks have any questions, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think, Lauren, we can stop the recording and we'll hang out here for just a few minutes. Thank you.